I have been silent for 25 years, and I suppose that is its own kind of confession. Silence can rot inside a man. It can thicken his blood. It can turn a memory into a wound that never seals. I'm not telling you this because I want forgiveness. I do not deserve that. I'm telling you because the thing I let go is no longer a secret, and because if it finds you one night, if you hear the breathing outside your window, you will at least know that someone once had the chance to stop it and failed. I had that chance. I held the key in my hand. I remember how cold it felt. I remember thinking that if I just walked away, none of this would follow me home. I was wrong. You should understand that from the beginning. Some doors are not meant to be opened. I opened one. Back then, I worked maintenance at a private wildlife facility tucked deep in the hills where fog sat low in the mornings, and the trees leaned in close like they were listening. It wasn't a zoo, not officially. The paperwork called it a research preserve. We housed injured animals, mostly. Wolves with broken legs. Bears tranquilized after wandering too close to towns. I kept the enclosures clean, patched fencing, replaced light bulbs that buzzed and flickered in the damp air. It was simple work, honest work. I liked the quiet. I liked the smell of wet earth and pine resin that clung to my clothes when I drove home at dusk. If you had asked me then whether I believed in monsters, I would have laughed in that dry, half-embarrassed way men do when they don't want to sound foolish. I believed in teeth and muscle and hunger. That was enough. The first time I saw the cage at the far end of the lower compound, it was covered with a thick green tarp. No label, no clipboard hanging from a hook. Just two reinforced locks and a strip of concrete stained darker than the rest. I remember the smell before anything else. Not rot exactly. Something warmer. Animal heat mixed with iron. I told myself it was just a bear. A big one. The facility sometimes took in confiscated exotics from private collectors who got in over their heads. But this enclosure had steel bars thicker than my wrist and concrete sunk deep into the ground. Overkill, I thought. I should have left it there. Curiosity is a slow poison. It was 3 weeks before I heard it. Not a roar, not a howl. A sound like breath being drawn through clenched teeth. Slow, controlled. I was sweeping gravel when it came again, steady and patient. I set the broom down and walked closer, telling myself I was imagining things. The tarp shifted slightly, though there was no wind. My skin prickled. I remember the exact texture of the air, heavy and humid, pressing against my face. I reached out and pulled the tarp back just enough to see between the bars. Two yellow eyes blinked in the darkness, level with mine, though whatever stood behind them was several feet back. They did not look confused. They did not look wild. They looked aware. I told my supervisor that night. He stared at me too long before answering. "Don't go near that one," he said. That was all. His voice carried something strained, something brittle. I pressed him. What was it? Where did it come from? But he waved me off and muttered about special contracts and federal permits. The next day, the tarp was gone. I wish I could say that ended my curiosity. It didn't. It made it worse. In full view, the creature stood hunched but unmistakably upright, taller than any man I'd known. Its legs bent wrong, like a wolf mid-stride frozen into human posture. Dark fur clung in thick patches, matted along the shoulders. Its hands, God, I still see them, were not paws. Long fingers tipped with black claws rested lightly against the bars. When it turned its head, the movement was deliberate, almost careful. I felt watched in a way that stripped something inside me raw. This was no simple animal. You might think I ran. I didn't. I came back the next day, and the next. I told myself I was checking structural integrity, inspecting welds, monitoring for stress fractures. Lies come easily when you repeat them often enough. The truth is, I felt something like pity. It rarely moved. It barely ate. The meat left for it often lay untouched until flies gathered thick around it. But when I approached alone, it would step forward. Not aggressively, just closer. Its eyes tracked me the way a man studies another man before speaking. I began to talk, quietly at first, about the weather, about how the fog would burn off by noon. Stupid things. It listened. Weeks passed. My supervisor stopped meeting my eyes. 2 other employees quit without notice. I overheard a fragment of conversation about a transport gone wrong, about something found in a ravine after reports of livestock slaughtered in patterns too clean for wolves. I never heard the full story. I'm not sure I wanted to. I had begun to believe that whatever stood in that cage did not belong there. It felt wrong to see it contained, shoulders brushing steel when it shifted. I told myself captivity was cruelty. I told myself we were the monsters. One evening, as rain hammered the compound roof and thunder rolled low and constant, the creature did something it had never done before. It spoke, not in words shaped like ours, more like a fractured imitation, a rasping, broken sound that bent around my name. I had never told it my name. The way it formed the syllables scraped against my bones. I should have reported it. Instead, I stepped closer. My heart pounded so loud I could barely hear the rain. "You don't belong here," I whispered. Its fingers tightened around the bars, metal groaning softly under the pressure. In its eyes, I saw something that looked like pleading. Or maybe I needed to see that. Maybe that's how it began, me deciding what those eyes meant. The key was kept in a locked cabinet in the administrative office. I knew the code. I had entered it 100 times for other enclosures. The night I took it, my hands shook so badly, I nearly dropped it on the tile floor. I told myself I was transferring it to a larger habitat. I told myself there had been a mistake. Outside, the storm had knocked out the perimeter lights, plunging the lower compound into a darkness broken only by lightning. It felt like the world had narrowed to that one cage and the sound of my breath. When I unlocked the first padlock, it clicked louder than a gunshot in my ears. The creature did not lunge. It did not snarl. It stepped back, giving me space. That restraint convinced me more than anything. I removed the second lock and pulled the gate open just enough to create an opening. For a second, just a second, I hesitated. I thought about livestock, about missing hikers, about the way my supervisor had looked at me. Then the creature moved. Of iron grew stronger. We stood there. Of iron grew stronger. We stood there, inches apart, rain misting across its shoulders, its eyes locked onto mine. I expected gratitude, some sign of understanding. Instead, I saw calculation, a depth that had nothing to do with freedom and everything to do with opportunity. It tilted its head once, almost curious, then turned and bounded into the trees with impossible speed, vanishing between lightning flashes. The forest swallowed it whole. The silence afterward was unbearable. No triumphant howl, no crashing branches, just rain and my own ragged breathing. I closed the gate out of reflex, as though that could undo what I had done. By morning, the alarms were blaring. My supervisor's face had gone the color of ash. There were tire tracks at the perimeter fence where something had leapt clean over. No blood, no fur, just absence. He asked me if I had seen anything unusual. I said no. The lie slid out too easily. The first reports came 3 days later. Livestock torn apart miles from the facility. Not eaten, just opened. organs missing with surgical precision. Then a hunter disappeared. They found his rifle bent in half. I watched the news at home, hands clasped so tight my knuckles cracked. I told myself it might not be the same creature. I told myself correlation was not causation. That word tasted bitter. A week after that, something came to my house. I woke to the smell of wet fur and copper. The night air was cold against my sweat-soaked skin. There was breathing outside my bedroom window, slow, measured. The same rhythm I had heard through steel bars. I did not move. I did not dare. The breathing continued for a long time, then faded. In the morning, claw marks scored the siding beside the window, deep and deliberate. Not random scratches. 3 parallel lines, perfectly spaced. A message. I quit the facility the next day. Officially, the preserve closed within months, amid investigations and lawsuits. Unofficially, no one ever found what had escaped. Sightings trickled in over the years, shadows on ridgelines, livestock mutilations, a camper found half buried near a stream. Always just enough doubt to dismiss. Always just enough evidence to keep the fear alive. I never spoke. I told myself that admitting what I had done would not bring back the dead. It would only ruin what remained of my life. That is the coward's calculus. You might be wondering why I am speaking now. Because last winter, during the first heavy snow, I saw tracks in my yard again. Large, bipedal, leading from the tree line to my back door and stopping there, as if whatever made them had stood inches from the handle and chosen not to knock. The prints were fresh, edges sharp. Snow had not yet softened them. I stood inside, hand hovering over the lock, feeling the old weight settle back into my chest. It had not forgotten me. I have replayed that night at the cage more times than I can count. I tell myself I acted out of compassion. That captivity is a cruelty no sentient being deserves. But compassion without wisdom is a loaded weapon. I saw intelligence in its eyes and mistook it for kinship. I heard my name in its broken voice and believed it meant connection. I wanted to be the man who freed a suffering creature. I did not consider that I might simply be the man who removed a barrier. There is a difference. If you live near heavy woods and you hear something pacing just beyond the reach of your porch light, do not assume it is a stray dog. If you find claw marks too deliberate to be random, do not dismiss them as tricks of bark and shadow. And if you ever stand before a locked door with a key in your hand and a creature watching you from the other side, remember that not every cage holds a victim. Some hold a warning. I have carried this for 25 years. Come inside. Not yet. Sometimes I think, come inside. Not yet. Sometimes I think that is the worst part, that it chooses not to. That it stands out there, patient as ever, reminding me that mercy can be a form of violence when given to the wrong thing. And every time the wind shifts through the trees and the boards of this old house creak, I wonder if tonight is the night it decides the debt is due. I should tell you that the tracks in the snow were not the first sign it had come back for me. They were simply the first I could not pretend away. For years before that winter, there were small disturbances, trash cans tipped but not rummaged through, the faint imprint of something heavy crossing the damp soil behind my shed, the uneasy silence of birds at dusk that lingered a little too long. Each time, I told myself it was coincidence, a stray bear, a neighbor's dog. The mind, when cornered by guilt, becomes inventive. It will build entire fictions just to avoid a single, unbearable truth. But the truth has a smell. It carries memory in it. That copper-tinged warmth that once clung to the air outside the cage found me again one humid August night. I had left the kitchen window open to let in a breeze. Around midnight, I woke with my throat dry and my heart already racing, as though some part of me had heard it before I consciously did. The sound came from the yard, not pacing this time, circling, gravel crunching softly beneath measured steps. There was no rush in it, no frenzy, just patience. I did not go to the window. I lay there and counted my breaths. Inhale, 4 seconds. Exhale, 4 seconds. I told myself that if I remained still, it would lose interest, that it would wander off in search of easier prey, that I was not special. I was not chosen. But then it stopped moving. In the morning, I found no marks. No 100. No 100. Just tracing, as if mapping the shape of my home. In the morning, I found no marks, no tracks. Nothing to prove the night had been anything more than a nightmare dredged up by an aging mind. That uncertainty almost broke me more than evidence would have. When there are no marks, you begin to doubt your own memory. You begin to wonder whether the cage, the key, the yellow eyes were distortions formed from guilt and rumor. But I still had the scar on my forearm from where its claw had grazed me the night I opened the gate. A thin white line I had never explained to anyone. That scar was real. I started driving the back roads again. I don't know why. Maybe I wanted to see if the forest still felt the same. Maybe I wanted proof that it was out there, separate from me, living its own existence that had nothing to do with my choice. The hills were quieter than I remembered. Fewer farms, more abandoned structures swallowed by creeping vines. At the edge of a clearing about 30 miles from the old facility site, I found something that made my hands go numb. A deer carcass laid open, with the same precision I had seen in those early reports decades ago. Organs removed, the rest untouched, not a bite wasted. I stood there too long, staring. The air buzzed with flies, thick and insistent. The smell hit the back of my throat, metallic and sweet. My eyes watered. I felt watched, not hunted, observed. The sensation was familiar enough that my knees nearly buckled. I turned slowly, scanning the tree line. Nothing moved. But the woods did not sound right. No rustle of squirrels, no chirping birds. Just a low hush, like the forest itself was holding back. Why? I heard myself whisper. It was a foolish question, carried off by wind that did not answer. That was the first time I considered going to the authorities. But what would I say? That 25 years ago, I released something from a reinforced cage because I mistook intelligence for innocence. That I had watched it vanish into the trees and chosen silence while people disappeared. There is no statute of limitations on shame. There is also no legal framework for admitting you freed a nightmare. I told myself that unless I saw it again, unless I had undeniable proof, I would remain quiet. Another coward's compromise. Proof came sooner than I expected. It was late autumn when the power went out across the county after a heavy storm. Trees snapped like brittle bones. Power lines sagged low over flooded ditches. I lit candles and sat in the living room, listening to the wind scrape branches against the roof. The house felt smaller in the dark, older. Every creak carried weight. Around midnight, there was a knock at the door. 3 slow raps, evenly spaced. My stomach turned to ice. No one drives out to my property unannounced, not in a storm. Long and thin across the wood. The knock long and thin across the wood. The knock came again. 3 deliberate strikes. I pressed my eye to the peephole. At first, I saw nothing but rain. Then it shifted forward into view. Not fully. Just enough for one yellow eye to catch the faint candlelight through the glass. It did not blink. The other half of its face remained hidden in darkness, but I could see the outline of fur plastered wet against its skull. It stood upright on my porch, head tilted slightly, as though curious whether I would answer. I could not breathe. My hand hovered inches from the lock. I don't know what I would have done if it had tried to force the door. But it didn't. After a long, unbearable minute, it leaned closer to the peephole. I swear to you, I saw recognition in that eye. Not hunger, not rage, recognition. Then it stepped back out of sight. I waited. 10 minutes, 20. When I finally opened the door, the porch was empty. Rain hammered the boards. No tracks remained in the mud. But 3 deep gouges scored the wood beside the frame, fresh and raw, perfectly spaced. The same pattern from years ago. That was when I understood something I had refused to consider. It had not come back to kill me. Not yet. It wanted me to know it was there. It wanted me to carry that knowledge the way I once carried the key. A reminder, a balance unsettled. I did what I should have done decades ago. I drove to the ruins of the old facility. Most of it had been demolished, but the lower compound's concrete foundation remained, cracked and overgrown. The cage was gone, removed during the investigation, but I could still see the indentation where it had stood. I walked the perimeter slowly, boots crunching on gravel that had sunk into soil. The air smelled of moss and decay. Familiar. "Come back," I said quietly, feeling foolish the moment the words left my mouth. "If this is about me, then finish it." The forest answered with silence, but as I turned to leave, I noticed something new etched into one of the remaining concrete slabs. 3 parallel lines, not old. The edges were sharp, dust still scattered at the base. My pulse roared in my ears. It had followed me there. Or perhaps it had been there first, waiting. I think about that eye at my door often, about the way it held mine without hostility. There is a cruelty in being spared. It suggests intention, strategy. I have begun to wonder whether releasing it was not the beginning of its freedom, but the beginning of something else. An experiment, a study. Perhaps I was the one placed in a cage that night, my life reduced to waiting for footsteps in the dark. If you expect a story about hunters gathering rifles and tracking a beast through the woods, you will be disappointed. No posse ever formed. No triumphant confrontation came. The world continues, indifferent. People disappear. Animals are found opened and precise. And I grow older, more aware of how thin the walls are between what we call myth and what stands breathing just outside our light. The last time I saw it was only a week ago. Dusk had settled heavy and blue across the yard. I was sitting on the back steps, listening to the distant hum of traffic miles away. The air was cold enough to sting my lungs. At the edge of the tree line, a shape separated itself from shadow. It did not approach. It simply stood there, tall and still, watching. I did not run inside. I did not shout. I just looked back. For a long moment, neither of us moved. Then it lifted one hand slowly and pressed its claws against the bark of a tree, carving 3 lines into it with casual ease. The sound carried across the yard, a dry, splintering scrape that made my teeth ache. It lowered its hand and faded into the forest. I don't know what it wants. I don't know whether this ends with my disappearance or with something worse, something public. But I know this. I opened the door. I believed I was choosing mercy over cruelty. And now, every night, when the wind shifts and the boards creak, I find myself listening for those 3 slow knocks, wondering whether the next time I look through the peephole, it won't be alone. I did not tell you everything, not because I wanted to make this dramatic, but because some truths feel like traps. Once you step into them, you cannot step back out unchanged. The creature was not alone that night at the facility. There was something else in the lower compound that no one ever documented. I only realized it years later, when the pattern began to repeat itself in ways I could no longer dismiss as coincidence. 3 knocks, 3 gouges, 3 parallel lines carved into wood, concrete, bark. At first I thought it was a signature, a mark of presence. But marks can also be instructions or invitations. 2 months ago, a boy went missing in a county north of mine. 15 years old, wandered off during a camping trip. His friends said he heard something moving in the dark and went to check it out. They described the sound the same way I once did: slow breathing, steady, deliberate. The search teams found nothing but a torn patch of soil near the tree line and 3 deep gouges scored into a fallen log nearby. When I saw the photograph in the local paper, my throat closed so tight I thought I would choke. The cuts were identical in spacing to the ones on my porch. I drove there the next morning. I don't know what I thought I would accomplish. Redemption, maybe. Some late attempt to do what I failed to do decades ago. The forest there felt younger, denser. Pines crowded close, their needles damp with recent rain. The ground was soft beneath my boots, sucking slightly at each step. Search crews had already trampled most of the obvious signs. But I found the log. I crouched beside it and ran my fingers near the gouges without touching them. The wood had been split cleanly, fibers sheared with surgical precision. Not slashed wildly, measured, controlled. It had been teaching itself restraint long before I met it. That thought struck me like a blow. The cage had not held a beast. It had held something learning. As I stood there, the forest went quiet. You will think I am dramatizing this, but silence has a texture. It thickens. It presses against your ears. I felt it settle around me, and I knew, without seeing, that I was not alone. My skin prickled the way it had the first time I pulled back that tarp. I turned slowly. It was closer than before. Not at the edge of the trees, but halfway between them and me. Fully upright, watching. Its fur had thinned along the shoulders, streaked faintly with gray, as though time marked it the same way it marked me. Its eyes were unchanged, yellow, focused, not feral, not frantic, calculating. "You've taken enough," I said, my voice thin in the damp air. The words sounded absurd the moment they left my mouth, as though morality meant anything to it. It tilted its head slightly, the same way it had the night I freed it. Recognition again, that unbearable awareness. Then it did something new. It opened its mouth, not in a snarl, but slowly, deliberately, and shaped a sound that scraped across my memory like a blade. My name. Not broken this time, not fractured, clear. I staggered back. My heel caught on a root, and I nearly fell. It did not advance. It simply watched me regain my balance. There was no rush in it, no hunger driving it forward, only patience. That was when I understood that whatever it had learned in captivity, it had continued learning outside of it, observing, practicing, refining. "You could have killed me," I whispered, "all those times." Its eyes did not waver. The space between us felt charged, like the air before lightning strikes. I thought about the boy, about the deer in the clearing, about the hunter whose rifle had been bent in half. I felt something fracture inside me, not fear exactly, but clarity. I had believed for years that it spared me out of some twisted gratitude, that my act of mercy had purchased hesitation. But now I saw the flaw in that belief. Predators do not spare prey out of kindness. They spare what interests them. It took one slow step closer. The ground barely seemed to protest beneath its weight. I smelled it then, wet fur, iron, the faint musk of soil clinging to its claws. My body screamed at me to run. Every instinct I had ignored decades ago surged forward at once. "Why me?" I asked. Its lips twitched, not quite a smile, not quite a snarl. Something in between. And then it raised one clawed hand and pressed 3 long fingers against its own chest. Slowly, deliberately. Then it extended that same hand toward me. 3. The realization hit like cold water. 3 marks, 3 knocks, 3 lines. It wasn't a signature. It was a count. My mind raced backward through years of reports. Livestock in 3s. 3 hikers missing over a span of 5 summers. 3 homes marked in a single rural neighborhood before a man vanished from his porch. I had dismissed those patterns as coincidence, the way investigators often do when faced with the irrational. But standing there, staring at that raised hand, I felt the shape of something far worse settle into place. I had been the first door opened, the first barrier removed, the first test of trust. It had learned from me that humans unlock what they do not understand, that they respond to pleas, to imitation, to a reflection of themselves in unfamiliar eyes. I had not freed it. I had taught it. My knees weakened. "You don't need to keep proving it," I said, though I don't know who I was trying to convince. It lowered its hand. For a moment, I thought it might lunge, that this would be the end, the inevitable reckoning I had imagined for years. But instead, it stepped back, not retreating in fear, retreating with purpose. It turned slightly, angling its body so that I could see past it into the deeper trees. Movement flickered there, subtle, almost imperceptible, a shift of shadow that did not align with wind. My breath left me in a thin, broken sound. Another pair of yellow eyes blinked from the darkness, lower to the ground, smaller, watching. My vision tunneled. The forest felt too close, pressing in from all sides. It had not been carving marks for remembrance. It had been carving them as lessons, repetition, demonstration, teaching something else how to knock. I stumbled backward, nearly falling again, my boots slipping in mud. The first creature, if I can still call it that, tilted its head once more, almost gently. Then it turned fully and melted into the trees. The smaller shadow followed. Within seconds, they were gone. The forest exhaled. Birds resumed their distant calls, as though nothing had happened. I stood there long after they vanished, heart pounding so hard it hurt. The boy was still missing. The search would continue for days, maybe weeks. They would find nothing but scattered traces and uncertainty. And somewhere beyond the reach of their flashlights, something was being shown how to survive among us. I drove home in a daze. Every passing tree line felt alive. Every shadow seemed deeper than it should have been. When I reached my house, I saw the marks on the tree at the edge of my yard had been joined by 3 smaller ones beneath them. Fresh, clean, precise. I went inside and locked every door, though I knew how useless that was. I sat at my kitchen table and stared at my hands for a long time. These hands had turned the key. These hands had pulled open the gate. I had believed I was acting out of compassion. Instead, I had participated in a transfer of knowledge. If it ever comes to your door and knocks 3 times, understand that it is not random. It is ritual. It is instruction passed down. I was the beginning of that lesson. And now, as I sit here listening to the wind move through the trees, I cannot shake the feeling that the next knock will not be a reminder. It will be a graduation. I haven't slept since the day I saw the second pair of eyes. Sleep feels like surrender now. When I close my eyes, I see the raised hand again, 3 claws lifted in quiet arithmetic. I hear my name spoken cleanly, no longer fractured. It learned clarity. It learned patience. And somewhere in the dark beyond my yard, something smaller is learning too. That is the part that hollows me out. Not the deaths I read about in the paper, not the gouges in bark. The apprenticeship. You need to understand something about that facility I worked at. I told you it closed under investigation, lawsuits, quiet settlements. Who cleaned the lower compound after? Who cleaned the lower compound after? The report described behavioral mimicry escalating beyond expected parameters. That was the phrase. Cold. Clinical. It mentioned vocal imitation attempts. It mentioned observational learning tied to staff routines. It mentioned a concern that containment might be compromised by empathetic interaction. Empathetic interaction. That was me. I found the shredded remains of that report in a burn barrel behind the administrative building the day after the power outage at my house. I had driven back there without thinking, pulled by a gravity I can't explain. The rain had half-soaked the ashes, but some words remained legible. Subject demonstrates pattern recognition. Subject tracks individual personnel with increased focus. Recommendation: minimize singular exposure. Minimize singular exposure. They had known, or at least suspected. And they had kept it anyway, studied it, fed it, tested it. I was not the first to talk to it. I was just the first fool to believe the conversation meant something mutual. 3 days after I found that burned report, the sheriff's department released a statement. Another disappearance. This time a couple in their late 30s. Their truck was found abandoned on a Forest Service road, doors open, engine still warm. No sign of struggle. Just 3 sets of parallel gouges scored into the hood, deep enough to crease the metal. I saw the photo online. The lines were different lengths, one long, one medium, one shorter. I felt the pattern tighten like a noose. I drove to the edge of my property that night, with a flashlight and a shotgun I hadn't fired in years. The metal felt foreign in my hands, heavy and pointless. I stood at the tree line and listened. The air was cold enough to sting the inside of my nose. The forest hummed softly with distant insects. For a long time, nothing moved. Then I heard it. Not the heavy footfall of the first one, lighter, faster, circling wide before drawing closer. My pulse quickened, but I didn't retreat. I told myself this was the moment I had avoided for 25 years, the moment when cowardice had to end. A shape slipped between the trees, smaller than the first, but still wrong in the way it held itself. Upright, shoulders slightly hunched, head turning in deliberate increments. Its eyes caught my flashlight beam and flashed gold. It did not shy away from the light. It studied it, studied me. "You don't have to do this," I said, and the words sounded absurd, even as I formed them. I wasn't sure who I was addressing anymore. The creature paused at the edge of the clearing, just beyond the reach of the porch light. I could smell damp soil and something faintly metallic riding the wind. Behind it, deeper in the dark, I sensed the first one. Not visible, not fully, but present. A pressure. A weight in the air that felt older, steadier, supervising. The smaller one took a step forward. Its movements were less fluid than the first's had been years ago. Still learning balance, still calibrating strength. It opened its mouth slightly, and for a terrifying second, I thought it would speak. Instead, it inhaled deeply, drawing in my scent, my fear, the memory of the man who had opened the first door. The shotgun trembled in my hands. I realized then that I did not know where to aim. At the smaller one, to stop the lesson midstream? At the unseen teacher in the dark? The weight of that choice crushed me. I had failed once because I chose compassion without caution. Now I risked failing again because I could not separate guilt from necessity. 3. A voice rasped from the darkness behind the smaller shape. Clear, controlled. The first one had not lost that skill. It had refined it. The word slid across the clearing and lodged in my chest. The smaller creature shifted its stance, as if responding to instruction. It raised one clawed hand, mimicking the gesture I had seen in the forest weeks ago. 3 fingers extended, not perfectly aligned yet, but close. My finger tightened on the trigger. For a split second, I imagined pulling it. The recoil, the blast splitting the night, the body collapsing, an ending. But even as I imagined it, I saw the flaw. Predators adapt, teachers adjust. If I killed the student, the teacher would find another. If I aimed at the teacher and missed, I would not get a second chance. "You learned from me," I said hoarsely. "So learn this too." I lowered the shotgun. The smaller creature tilted its head, confusion flickering across its features. The first one stepped forward just enough for its outline to separate from shadow. Taller now than I remembered, or perhaps I was simply more aware of its scale. Its eyes held mine, unreadable. "You want a door?" I whispered. "Take me." The words tasted like rust, but they were honest. If this was about balance, about ritual, about completing a count, then let the count end where it began. Let the lesson circle back to its source. The forest seemed to lean in. The smaller creature glanced toward the larger one, waiting, always waiting. The first one considered me in silence. I felt the weight of 25 years press into that gaze. Every disappearance, every mark carved into wood and metal, every night I chose silence over confession. It stepped closer, close enough that I could see the faint gray streaks threading through its fur, close enough that the smell of iron filled my lungs. It reached out slowly, one clawed hand extending toward my chest. I did not flinch. I forced myself not to. The tip of one claw pressed lightly against my sternum, just over my heart. Not piercing. Not yet. A test. I felt the cold edge through fabric, the promise of pressure. 3, it said again, softer this time. Then it did something I did not expect. It shifted its hand slightly and drew 3 shallow lines across the fabric of my jacket without breaking skin. A mark. Claiming or completion, I could not tell. It stepped back. The smaller one mirrored the motion in the air, as though rehearsing. And then, as suddenly as they had emerged, both shapes receded into the trees. No rush, no violence, just withdrawal. I stood there long after they vanished, the shotgun hanging useless at my side. My chest ached where the claw had traced its path. I went inside and looked in the mirror. The fabric of my jacket bore 3 clean slits. Beneath it, faint red lines marked my skin, shallow but deliberate. Not a kill, not yet. I think I understand now. The count was never about victims alone. It was about thresholds. 3 knocks before a door opens, 3 marks before a lesson advances, 3 encounters before a cycle closes. I was the first door. The boy in the woods may have been the second, and tonight, with that claw against my heart, I became the third. What happens after 3? I don't know. That is the part that keeps me awake. Because if 3 is completion, then something new begins at 4. And I have the sinking, unbearable feeling that whatever stands in the forest beyond my yard is no longer counting up. It is preparing to start again. The night after it marked my chest, the air felt different, not heavier, quieter, as if something had settled into place. I kept touching the 3 faint lines beneath my shirt, expecting them to sting or swell or darken into something worse. They didn't. They remained shallow, almost careful, a reminder, not a wound. That frightened me more than blood would have. Violence is simple. Intention is not. I stayed awake in the living room with the lights off, watching the tree line through the window. Every few minutes I caught myself holding my breath, listening for movement. None came. Around 3 in the morning, exhaustion dragged me under despite myself. I dreamed of the cage. Not the one at the facility as it had been, but a larger version of it standing in the middle of my yard. The door hung open. Inside, there was nothing. Outside, 3 sets of tracks circled it endlessly. When I woke, the house was still. Pale gray light seeped through the curtains. For a moment I felt foolish, almost relieved. Maybe it had been a final warning. Maybe the count had closed, and whatever ritual it followed had moved on. That fragile hope lasted exactly 12 seconds. There were 3 knocks at the door. Slow, even, calm. My mouth went dry. I stood carefully, every joint stiff, and walked toward the sound. The house creaked under my weight. The knocks came again, not louder, not more urgent, simply repeated. I did not look through the peephole this time. I already knew what would be there. Instead, I spoke through the wood. "It's done," I said. "You made your point." Silence answered. Then from the other side of the door, I heard breathing. Not one rhythm, 2. One deep and steady, one lighter, slightly uneven. The teacher and the student. I closed my eyes. There's nothing left to teach. A faint scrape slid across the surface of the door. Not gouging, not yet. Just the light drag of a claw testing grain. Then a voice, lower than before, clearer than ever. "Open." The word was precise, controlled, not an imitation anymore, a command. For a split second, anger cut through my fear. Not at them, at myself. I had opened one door already because I believed I was offering freedom. If I opened this one, it would not be mercy. It would be obedience. I saw the shape of the lesson then, as stark as bone. It had learned that humans respond to empathy. Now it was testing whether we respond to authority. "No," I said, and my voice trembled despite my effort. "You don't get another door." The breathing on the other side did not quicken. No rage, no pounding fists, just stillness. And then 3 sharp knocks in rapid succession, harder than before. The wood shuddered. Behind the door, something shifted. The smaller rhythm moved closer, as if pressing its face near the surface. I imagined it listening to my heartbeat through the grain. I imagined it cataloging the tremor in my voice. "Open," the first voice repeated, softer now, almost coaxing. My hand hovered near the lock despite myself. That was the worst part, the reflex, the instinct to comply, to end the tension by giving in. That is how it begins, not with force, but with relief. I stepped back instead. "You don't need me anymore," I said. "You've learned enough." There was a pause long enough that I wondered if they had gone. Then a third sound joined the breathing. Faint at first, further from the door. Another presence approaching across the porch boards. My blood turned to ice. 3 sets of breaths. The teacher, the student, and something new. The pattern was not closing. It was expanding. The realization cracked something open inside me. I moved quickly then, not toward the door, but toward the hallway closet where I kept old flares from my boating days. I don't know why I grabbed them. Fire is primal. Fire interrupts patterns. It doesn't negotiate. I returned to the door, heart slamming against my ribs. The breathing continued, patient as ever. I struck the flare against the rough strip along its cap. It ignited with a violent hiss, flooding the room with red light and acrid smoke. Shadows leapt across the walls. Through the thin seam at the bottom of the door, I saw movement falter. I yanked the door open before I could reconsider. They stood there, all three. The first in the center, tall and composed. The second slightly behind and to the left, posture more confident than before. And the third, smaller still, movements twitching with unrefined tension. Its eyes blinked against the sudden red glare. For the first time, I saw uncertainty ripple through them. Not fear exactly. Disruption. The flare spat sparks onto the porch boards. Smoke curled around their legs. "You want a lesson?" I shouted over the hiss. "Here's one." I flung the flare at their feet. It clattered and rolled, burning bright against the damp wood. The smallest one recoiled sharply, stumbling back. The second shifted, claws scraping across the boards in a protective arc. The first did not retreat immediately. It watched me through the red haze, eyes narrowed, calculating. For a heartbeat, we stood suspended in that light. Teacher and failed teacher, each measuring the other. Then the flare popped violently, sending a spray of sparks outward. The first creature stepped back at last, herding the other two toward the yard with a subtle motion of its arm. Not panicked, controlled withdrawal. They retreated to the edge of the clearing, red light flickering across fur and eyes. The smallest one glanced back repeatedly, as if memorizing the scene. The lesson had not ended. It had shifted. The first creature held my gaze one final time. In that look, I did not see rage. I saw adjustment, a recalibration of strategy. Fire had been added to the equation, resistance documented. Then they vanished into the trees. The flare burned out on my porch, leaving a blackened scorch mark. 3 sets of tracks marked the damp earth beyond, partially illuminated by the dying red glow. I stood there until smoke stopped curling into the night air. I know what this means. They will not knock the same way again. The count will not repeat in such a simple pattern. It will evolve. That is what it does. That is what I helped it learn. I closed the door slowly and locked it, though the gesture felt ceremonial. My house smells faintly of sulfur now. My chest still bears 3 shallow lines. Outside, the forest has gone quiet again. Too quiet. I don't think they came tonight to kill me. I think they came to see whether I would open the door a second time. I didn't. And somehow that feels less like a victory and more like the beginning of something far worse. I spent the rest of that night sitting on the floor with my back against the door, the shotgun across my knees, and the dead flare smoking faintly beside me like a spent fuse. Dawn came slowly, reluctantly, as if even the sun was unsure whether it should return. When light finally crept through the windows, it didn't bring relief. It brought clarity. The porch boards were scorched black where the flare had burned. Beyond them, the earth was churned with tracks, 3 distinct sizes, 3 distinct weights. They didn't lead away in a straight line. They circled the house once, wide and deliberate, before disappearing into the trees. Not fleeing, mapping. That was when I understood that the knocks had never been requests. They were assessments. I packed what little I needed that morning. Clothes, the shotgun, a handful of shells I wasn't even sure would matter. I didn't bother with food. Hunger felt irrelevant. I left the house unlocked. That decision surprised me, but it felt important, like removing one last illusion. If they came back, I didn't want there to be another door lesson waiting for them. I drove toward the old facility again, hands tight on the steering wheel, every mile stretching thin with memory. The road had degraded since the last time, more potholes, more trees leaning inward, reclaiming asphalt inch by inch. The place smelled wrong before I even stepped out of the truck. Wet concrete, rust, and something older underneath it all. Something like a kennel long abandoned, but never truly empty. The lower compound was quieter than it should have been. No insects, no birds. The foundation where the cage once stood was damp, darkened, as if it had been rained on recently, despite the clear sky. I knelt there, pressing my palm against the concrete. It was cold, cold in a way that felt active, like it was drawing heat out of me. "This is where it started," I said aloud, my voice swallowed quickly by the trees. "This is where it should end." I don't know what I expected, a confrontation, a final reckoning, some dramatic symmetry to justify the years of silence and fear. What I got instead was a sound behind me, measured footsteps, heavy but unhurried. I didn't turn right away. I already knew who it would be. When I did turn, only the first one stood there. No student, no third shadow, just the original. It was closer than it had ever been, fully exposed in daylight. Time had marked it more clearly now. Gray streaked its fur. Scars lined one shoulder, old and clean, not the result of claws or bullets, but of something harder to classify. Close calls, maybe. Experience. Its posture was relaxed, almost casual, as if this meeting had been inevitable. "You came back," it said. The words were unmistakable now, not mimicry, not imitation, language. "I never left," I replied. For a moment, neither of us moved. The forest felt suspended around us, like a held breath stretched too long. I thought of the burned report, of empathetic interaction, of how carefully they had tried to manage exposure, as though they had sensed what prolonged attention could become. "You taught," it said. "We learned." "And now you're teaching them," I said, my voice rough. "How many?" Its eyes flicked past me briefly, toward the deeper trees, not signaling, acknowledging. "Enough." The word landed heavier than any number. I raised the shotgun then, not aiming, just holding it between us like a boundary. "It stops," I said. "Here, no more doors, no more lessons." It studied the weapon with mild curiosity. Then it shook its head once, slow and deliberate. "Doors are human," it said. "You made them. You open them. We only ask." The weight of that nearly buckled me. I saw it then, the shape of the moral trap I had stepped into all those years ago. I had framed the world in terms of cages and freedom, cruelty and mercy. But it had reframed it in terms of access, of thresholds, of who controls them. "What do you want?" I asked. It stepped closer, close enough that I could see my reflection warped faintly in its eyes. "Continuation." I laughed then, a short, broken sound that startled even me. "You think this ends well?" I asked. "You think they won't hunt you eventually, burn these woods to the ground?" It considered that. "Perhaps," it said, "but not yet." That was the moment I knew there would be no victory here, no clean ending, only delay, mitigation, damage control in a world that preferred denial to responsibility. I lowered the shotgun, not in surrender, in acknowledgement. "I'll talk," I said. "I'll tell them everything, the cage, the release, the marks, the counting, all of it." It watched me carefully, weighing that offer the way it weighed everything. Then it nodded once. "That will change the pattern," it said. "Yes," I answered. "That's the point." Silence stretched between us. Somewhere far off, a bird finally called, tentative and unsure. The creature stepped back toward the trees, not hurried, not alarmed. "We will adapt," it said over its shoulder. "I know," I replied. "So will we." It vanished into the forest without another sound. I stayed there until the light shifted and the chill in my bones deepened. When I finally left, I didn't look back. Some beginnings don't deserve witnesses. I'm telling you all of this now because silence was the first door I opened after the cage, and I won't open it again. If this story ends with fear spreading instead of shadows, with people watching the tree line instead of laughing at it, then maybe that will be the first lesson we didn't have to learn the hard way. But if one night you hear 3 slow knocks at your door, remember this: you don't owe curiosity an answer. You don't owe empathy your safety. And not every voice that learns to speak is asking to be understood. Some are only checking to see if you'll listen. I thought speaking would feel like release. It didn't. It felt like stepping into cold water and realizing it was deeper than I'd judged. I went to the sheriff first. I sat across from a man young enough to be my son and told him a story that sounded like decay wearing the shape of confession. I told him about the facility, about the cage, about the key in my hand, and the storm that swallowed the sound of the lock. I told him about 3 knocks, 3 lines, 3 breaths outside a door. I did not embellish, I did not dramatize. I gave him the plain version. He watched me the way people watch a stranger on a bus who's speaking too loudly to himself. Concerned, distant, polite. "Do you have proof?" he asked gently. I showed him the marks on my chest, faded now but visible. I showed him photographs of the gouges on my porch, the tree, the old foundation slab. He nodded, wrote notes, thanked me for coming in. There would be patrols, he said, increased presence near the Forest Service roads. I could see the careful line he was walking, between humoring a troubled man and filing a report that would never see daylight. That was the first door that did not open. The second was public. I posted everything online. Old employee records I still had copies of, the fragments of the burned report, photos of the tracks, the patterns in missing persons cases I'd compiled obsessively over the years. I expected ridicule. I got that. I expected threats. I got a few. What I did not expect was the quiet messages that began to arrive. 3 knocks last night, 3 lines on the barn, 3 shapes at the edge of the clearing. Different states, different counties, same pattern, same restraint. Always 3. It had already spread further than I realized, or perhaps it had never stayed in one place to begin with. The nights changed after that. Not louder, not more violent, just closer. I would sit in the living room with the lights off and feel watched, not from one direction, but from several. The forest no longer felt like a single presence. It felt distributed, as if the lesson had been absorbed and replicated. One evening, just after dusk, I heard the familiar rhythm approach the porch. Not 1 set, not 2, 3. The boards creaked under their weight. My heart pounded, but something else rose with it. Resolve, sharpened by exhaustion. I did not reach for a flare this time. I did not reach for the shotgun. I walked to the door and stood inches from it. "People know," I said through the wood. "They're watching now." Silence. Then a faint exhale. "You changed pattern," the voice on the other side said. "The original, calm as ever." "Yes." A pause stretched thin. "Pattern adapts." "I know." There was no knocking this time, no test of obedience. Instead I heard movement, soft, coordinated, a repositioning. My window to the right rattled lightly. Another presence near the back wall, the third near the corner of the house. Not surrounding, mapping again. "You think doors stop us," it said. "No," I replied quietly. "I think light slows you." That word hung between us. Light, exposure, witness. I flipped on every switch in the house at once. The interior flooded bright. Then I opened the door wide, before fear could intervene. They stood there, just beyond the spill of light. the original in the center, the two others flanking it, taller now than when I first saw them, growing into their balance. Their eyes reflected the porch light sharply, pupils narrowing. "We don't open," the original said. "We enter." "Not tonight," I answered. "Not like this." For the first time, I saw something like irritation crease its expression, a subtle tightening around the eyes. It stepped forward just enough that the light brushed its fur. It did not recoil. It endured, testing tolerance, measuring threshold. "You were first door," it said. "You remain door." The words chilled me more than any threat. Not prey, not enemy. Portal, access point. It had never been about revenge or gratitude. I was an interface, a bridge between concealment and exposure. "I'm closing," I said, "permanently." Behind it, the other two shifted, restless, less patient than their teacher. The smallest of them, no longer small, leaned slightly into the light, nostrils flaring. Curious. "3," the original said softly. "I know," I replied, "but after 3 comes a wall." Silence. The air between us hummed. I held its gaze without blinking, though my eyes burned. I forced myself not to retreat, not to shrink back into shadow. The porch light buzzed faintly above us, a mundane sound, human, artificial, steady. Finally, the original stepped back, not in defeat, in recalculation. It glanced once toward the trees, then back at me. "We will not knock," it said. "I know." And then they withdrew. Not hurried, not chaotic, simply absent a moment later, swallowed by dark beyond the reach of bulbs and wires. I stood there long after they vanished, the door still open, light spilling uselessly into trees that did not care. My hands trembled only when I finally shut it. You might think this is victory. It isn't. It's escalation. They won't announce themselves now. They won't perform ritual on porches. The pattern has shifted beyond theatrics. That's what exposure does. It forces refinement. But here's the difference. Before they studied us in isolation, one cabin, one hiker, one unlocked door. Now more people are watching their tree lines. More lights stay on at night. More doors stay closed, not out of ignorance, but out of awareness. Will that stop them? I don't know. I only know that I am no longer the only one listening for 3 slow knocks. And if I have to remain the door they first opened, then I will stand here in the frame, lights blazing, refusing to swing quietly on their hinges again. Because some lessons spread in darkness, and some only survive if we stop pretending we don't hear them breathing just beyond the glass. The knocks never came again. That's the part that unsettles me most. Not because they stopped, because they evolved. After that night with the porch light blazing and the 3 of them standing just beyond it, the pattern shifted completely. No more ritual performances, no more deliberate tests at my door. The forest returned to its ordinary sounds, wind in branches, insects at dusk, the distant bark of a neighbor's dog. For weeks, nothing happened. No messages online, no new gouges in barns or truck hoods. The news cycle moved on to other tragedies, other distractions, and yet the quiet felt wrong. Predators do not vanish when observed. They adapt their approach. I kept posting, not frantic warnings, measured updates, patterns, precautions, documentation. I stopped using the word monster. I stopped framing it as a legend. I described behaviors instead: threshold testing, vocal mimicry, coordinated positioning, escalation from request to command. I wanted people to understand the mechanics, not the myth. Then the first report came in from someone who had read everything. No knocks, as if gauging distance by response. When she remained silent, it stopped. The next morning she found 3 sets of tracks near the edge of her yard, but none approaching the house. They were learning efficiency. Why knock when a name works better? I realized then that the 3-knock ritual had been a developmental phase, a visible pattern to measure human reaction. Curiosity, compliance, fear, resistance. Once enough data was gathered, the ritual became unnecessary. They no longer needed doors. They needed recognition. 2 nights ago, I heard my name again. Not at the door, from inside the house. Soft, almost thoughtful. I was in the kitchen when it happened. The refrigerator hummed steadily. The clock ticked on the wall. Then, from the dark hallway behind me, my name drifted forward in a voice that wasn't quite mine, wasn't quite theirs. It carried the cadence of something practiced. I did not turn around. That may be the only thing I have done correctly from the beginning. I stood there gripping the counter until my knuckles whitened, heart hammering so hard I could hear it in my ears. The voice did not repeat. No footsteps followed. No shadow crossed the floor. Just the ordinary hum of appliances. Slowly, carefully, I checked every room. Nothing. No broken windows, no forced locks, no open doors. But on the inside of the hallway wall, near the corner where light doesn't quite reach, 3 faint lines had been carved into the dry wall. Not deep, not violent, precise. They hadn't entered physically, they had entered conceptually. The realization settled into me with a sick clarity. The first lesson had never been about cages or doors. It was about access points in human behavior. Curiosity, empathy, authority, fear, recognition. Now they were testing perception itself. If they can make you turn toward a voice that isn't there, they don't need to cross a threshold. You do it for them. Yesterday I received 3 separate messages from 3 different towns. Each person reported hearing their own voice calling from somewhere slightly out of sight, behind a shed, from a tree line, once even from the far end of a grocery store parking lot at night. Each time the voice stopped when ignored. Each time 3 tracks were found somewhere nearby the next morning. They are no longer asking for doors. They are mapping awareness. The original came back last night, alone. I felt it before I saw it. A pressure in the air, a subtle displacement in the way the forest held itself. I stepped onto the porch without turning on the light this time. We both stood in darkness. "You adjust," it said calmly. "So do you," I replied. "Won't always get an answer." It tilted its shoulders against the faint starlight. "Knocking inefficient," it said, voice efficient. "You won't always get an answer." It tilted its head. "Not needed." That chilled me more than anything it had said before. "You think this ends with you replacing us?" I asked quietly. "No," it replied. "Coexist." The word felt wrong in its mouth. "You call it coexistence when we stop responding," I said. "When we stop opening, stop turning toward voices in the dark." Yes. It wasn't conquest. It wasn't slaughter. It was filtration. Those who respond are removed. Those who ignore remain. Over time, what's left is a population that does not react, that does not investigate, that does not open doors. A species subtly reshaped by avoidance. "You're not hunting," I whispered. "Learning," it corrected. We stood there in silence for a long moment. I felt old in that silence, small, like I had glimpsed something too large to meaningfully oppose. "You started it," it said finally. I didn't argue. It wasn't accusation. It was fact. I opened the first door. I demonstrated that humans respond to perceived suffering. to language, to shared recognition. That lesson scaled, expanded, refined. Now the lesson continues without doors. It stepped back toward the trees. "We will not knock," it said again. "I know, and you will speak." "Yes." It paused one last time. "3 complete," it said softly. Then it was gone. I don't know what happens at 4. Maybe there is no 4. Maybe 3 was stabilization, teacher, student, environment. Maybe the next phase isn't numeric at all. All I know is this: if you hear your name spoken from somewhere you cannot see clearly, do not answer. If you think you hear movement just beyond the edge of light, let it remain there. Curiosity is an opening. Recognition is an opening. Response is an opening. I opened the first door with a key. The next ones were opened with attention. They don't need wood or hinges anymore. They just need you to turn around. And if enough of us refuse to turn, maybe that is the one lesson they cannot adapt to. But if one night you hear your own voice speaking from the hallway behind you, don't check. That might be the final threshold. And once you cross it, I don't think anyone comes back to describe what they learned. The night he opened the cage, he didn't feel brave. He felt sick. The lock had rusted so deeply it screamed when it snapped, metal shrieking into the trees like it was begging him not to do this. The creature didn't lunge. It didn't growl. It just stood there in the darkness of the enclosure, shoulders rising and falling slowly, yellow eyes reflecting the lantern light like twin coins at the bottom of a well. For a moment, he thought it might be smaller than he remembered, weaker. Then it stepped forward and the ground answered with a dull, heavy thud. Not an animal's step, not a man's. Something in between. He should have run. Every instinct told him to run. But he held the gate open instead. The Dogman tilted its head slightly, studying him, memorizing him. 25 years later, he would still dream about that look. Not rage, not gratitude, but recognition. As if it understood the transaction being made. Freedom for silence. The forest behind them was dead quiet. No insects, no wind. Even the leaves seemed to hold their breath. "Go," he whispered, though his throat barely worked. The creature didn't move at first. It leaned forward, sniffing the air around him, and he felt its breath through his jacket, hot, damp, carrying the metallic scent of old blood and pine sap. Then slowly, it stepped past him, close enough that its shoulder brushed his arm. Dense fur, solid muscle, a tremor of contained violence. He flinched, but it didn't strike. It walked toward the tree line like it had always known the way home. Just before disappearing into the shadows, it stopped, turned its head, and those eyes locked onto his again. That was when he understood. This wasn't mercy, it was a beginning. He told no one. Not the men who ran the facility, not the hunters who would have tracked it, not even his own brother, who had warned him never to get emotionally involved. The official story was simple. Containment breach during a storm. Evidence destroyed. Tracks lost in the floodwaters. Case closed. But there had been no storm that night. Only stillness. He burned the paperwork himself, wiped the surveillance drives, smashed the tranquilizer rifles with a sledgehammer, and buried the pieces in separate places miles apart. He thought that would be enough. For years, it seemed like it was. Livestock deaths in neighboring counties were blamed on feral packs. Missing hikers were written off as exposure accidents. Grainy trail cam images were dismissed as hoaxes. And every time he saw one, every blurred silhouette too tall, too upright, his stomach folded in on itself. Because he knew the posture. He knew the width of those shoulders. He knew the patience in the way it watched before moving. 25 years is a long time to carry a secret, but it's longer when the secret occasionally leaves footprints outside your house. The first time he saw the tracks in his own yard, they were perfectly placed along the tree line, not approaching, not retreating, just there, as if it had come to check on him, or to remind him. He started sleeping with the lights on after that, not because he feared an attack. Deep down, he didn't think the Dogman wanted to kill him. If it had decades of opportunity. No, what unsettled him was the idea that it was watching, learning, adapting. Reports over the years described something different from the half-starved captive he had freed. This one was strategic. It avoided cameras, circled hunters, drove prey into traps that weren't set by humans. There were whispers in small-town forums of something that stood outside bedroom windows but never broke the glass. Something that mimicked distant calls to lure people deeper into woods before vanishing completely. Evolution doesn't happen that fast, experts said, but captivity changes things. Isolation sharpens things. And if intelligence had always been there, perhaps freedom had simply given it room to grow. The worst part wasn't the sightings, it was the pattern. The creature never attacked randomly. Every incident connected back somehow to the old facility. Former staff, contractors, investors. One by one, misfortunes stacked up around the people who had profited from the cage. Bankruptcies, disappearances, accidents. He kept waiting for his turn. When it didn't come, the waiting became heavier than fear. On the 25th anniversary of the release, the forest behind his property went silent again. The same suffocating stillness from that night. No crickets, no owls. Just pressure in the air, like the moment before a storm breaks, except there were no clouds. He stepped onto his porch without thinking, drawn by something older than logic. The tree line shimmered in the moonlight, and there it was, taller than before, broader, the fur darker, almost absorbing the light. It didn't hide. It stood in the open, watching him the way it had through the cage door all those years ago. No aggression, no rush, just awareness. A long, unbroken stare across the distance between them. His heart pounded so hard, he thought it might split his ribs. "I kept my word," he called out, voice shaking but clear. The Dogman didn't move. A breeze stirred at last, brushing through the leaves like a quiet exhale. And then, slowly, the creature nodded. Not an animal twitch, not random motion. A deliberate dip of the head. Recognition, agreement, closure, or something close to it. After a few seconds that stretched into forever, it turned and walked back into the forest. This time there was no pause at the edge, no lingering glance, just disappearance. The night sounds returned gradually, hesitant at first, then normal. He stood there long after it was gone, understanding something he hadn't allowed himself to believe before. He hadn't freed a monster that night. He had interrupted a sentence. And for 25 years, the forest had been writing the rest of it.